Today I'm making this easy homemade home-style white bread. To make this delicious home-style white bread, I'm going to use my KitchenAid mixer today, but you can just as easily make this using your bread machine dough cycle. You can make this by hand, or you can use any stand mixer that you have. So let's just get started. Super easy recipe and super yummy bread. I'm going to use 1 cup of lukewarm water. You want this to be about 100 to 110 degrees, and this just helps your yeast to activate without being too hot that it kills it. So 1 cup water right on into your mixing bowl. And next we want 3 tablespoons of melted butter. You can also use 3 tablespoons of oil if you'd rather do that. Any kind of oil will work, any kind of fat. But I'm going to use 3 tablespoons of melted butter. Just going to put it right on in here with my warm water. And I sometimes use salted butter and sometimes I use unsalted butter. I just use whatever's on sale or whatever I have. And I really haven't found much of a difference. You can use a little bit less salt if you use salted butter if you want to, but I keep my recipe exactly the same whether I use salted or unsalted. And next I'm going to use 2 tablespoons of honey. You can also use 2 tablespoons of sugar if you'd rather do that. Sugar is a little bit easier to work with, so I very oftentimes get out my sugar instead of my honey, but honey makes this really good too. So 2 tablespoons of sugar or honey, whichever you'd like to use. And next we want our yeast. This is my Red Star Active Dry Yeast. I usually use this kind of yeast. I'll also use instant yeast for some things, but this is what I mainly reach for when I'm making my bread. I buy it in these 2-pound packages. This is definitely the cheapest way to buy your yeast. Way cheaper than buying those little packets that you use or those little jars that you see at the grocery store. This is way cheaper. And I put it in my freezer. I get it out right in time to make bread. You don't have to let it come to room temperature. You just use it in your bread and stick it back in the freezer. So for this recipe, I want 1.5 teaspoons of this yeast. Now, even though I'm using this active dry, you can definitely use instant, rapid rise, whatever you want to use. So just throw that into your mixing bowl. And next I want my flour. So I'm going to use 3 cups of bread flour, but you can definitely use all-purpose flour if that's what you have. I'm going to use 3 cups. The bread flour will give you a little bit better rise than all-purpose flour and a little bit better chew, but it is more expensive these days, and I think just use whatever you have. If you have all-purpose flour, use that. It's going to turn out great. If you happen to have some Vital Wheat gluten, then add about a tablespoon of that to your all-purpose flour and it'll make like a bread flour for you. But all-purpose flour, bread flour, either one is great. Don't use self-rising flour in this bread though. Okay, so 3 cups of flour. I buy my flour in bulk in big 25-pound bags, and then I just pour the bag into these 5-gallon buckets, and I have these great Gamma lids on top. And I just keep them in my pantry like this and down in my food storage. So this is a great way to store your flours, your rice, your oats, your wheat berries, whatever you want. I love these big old buckets for that. And next I'm going to use some dry milk powder. Now, this is totally optional. You don't have to stress about it. If you don't have it, then don't use it in your bread. But when you use dry milk powder in your bread, it gives you a softer, fluffier texture to your bread. So I really like using it. And I like to store these in my food storage. I don't love drinking this stuff, but I do love using it in my bread. So I try to cycle through it for that. And I have it in an emergency. If I do need to drink it, I'll drink it. But I'm going to use 2 tablespoons of this dry milk powder. Usually dry milk powder is non-fat dry milk powder, but you can also find it with the milk fat in it. Either one works great in this bread. So just throw that into your bowl if you're going to use it. And like I said, if you don't have it, don't worry about it. And next I'm going to use some salt. I like using this Redmond's Real salt, but use white iodized table salt, the pink Himalayan salt, whatever you want. Just make sure you pour it away from your bowl because you already have all your other ingredients in there and you don't want to ruin it right now at the last step. So 1.5 teaspoons of salt right on into your mixing bowl. Those are all of the ingredients to our home-style white bread. Now, I'm going to let the mixer do the hard work. I'm going to throw this into my mixer. And I'm going to let this knead for about 6 to 8 minutes on speed 2. I do that in my KitchenAid or in my Bosch if I'm using my Bosch mixer. So you want it to be about medium low and let it knead with a dough hook. Make sure you use your dough hook. let this go for about 6 to 8 minutes, and I'll show you what your dough should look like. Here's the dough to our Homestyle white bread kneading in the mixer. Now this is such an important step. You don't just want to throw your ingredients in the mixer, turn it on, and walk away until it's done kneading. You want to check on your ball of dough. If it's looking too dry, you might want to add another 1/8 of a cup of water until it's looking smooth and elastic. If it's looking too wet, if it's sticking to the sides and the bottom a lot, then that dough is going to be hard to handle. So you're going to want to add a little bit more flour. But for me, this is looking pretty good. And I am going to let this knead just for a few more minutes for a total of 8 minutes. And then it'll be time to let it rest. Okay, I've let my dough knead for 8 minutes in my KitchenAid mixer on speed 2. Now let's look at the dough. Now it's so important to look at your dough and not really go off measurements so much for your flour and your water. You definitely want to check out your dough and see if you need to add more water, more flour. It's definitely going to depend on your climate, the temperature, the weather outside. Some days for me, for this very exact same recipe, I'll use a cup of water. Sometimes it'll be a cup and 1/8 of water. Sometimes it'll even be a cup and 1/4 of water. So you just kind of have to check on your ball of dough and see what it needs. So this dough's looking really great. Look at this. You can stretch it, it's elasticy, that means the gluten is really well developed. You can handle it, and that's what I want for this ball of dough. So now that we're to this point, it's time to let the dough rest, and we're gonna let it rise. So I'm gonna throw it back into my mixing bowl. You can use a different bowl if you wanna use your mixer for something else, but I'm gonna cover my bowl with this warm, wet tea towel, and I'm gonna let this just rest on my counter, let the dough rise. This will take probably about 45 minutes to an hour, and you want your dough to expand. Not necessarily double in size, but definitely expand. I will show you this when it's ready to punch down and shape into a loaf. It's been an hour, and the dough for our Homestyle white bread has been rising. Let's check it out. There it is. That looks perfect. It's expanded. It's pretty much doubled in size, and this is exactly what you want it to look like. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to punch down my dough. Just punch it down, and then turn it out of your bowl. Okay, this looks great. Now I'm just gonna press out my dough. Just press it out, and I want it to be about as wide as my loaf pan is long. This is my cast iron loaf pan. I always bake my bread in cast iron. I love cast iron because it doesn't have any of those chemicals or coatings or anything like that in there to get into our food. I poured about 1/2 tablespoon to a tablespoon of oil into my loaf pan, and I just rubbed it all around. I usually use olive oil or coconut oil, and that works really well. So definitely rub it all in the little corners and everything like that so that your bread doesn't stick. And I recommend doing that with any loaf pan that you use, even if it says it's non-stick. Okay, so I'm gonna press it out, and now I'm gonna just roll it into a loaf. Today I'm going to do the head down, shoulders in method. So I just kind of pull the top down, or the head, and I pull in the shoulders or the sides, and then I press that out with the palms of my hand, and then I just continue to roll it into a nice tight loaf. This will give you that really good surface tension that you need to have a really beautiful loaf of bread. So roll it up and then just kind of squeeze it together, pat it out, flip it over, press those seams together really well. That'll keep your bread from bursting or expanding in the oven while it bakes. Give it a good pat, and there we go. That looks perfect. Now I'm just gonna throw it into my cast iron loaf pan, just plop it in there, and there we go. Now I'm gonna let it rise for the second time. This will only take about 30 minutes, maybe even 20 minutes. It just kind of depends on the temperature of your home. So I'm gonna watch this probably 20-30 minutes. While it's rising, I'm gonna go ahead and get my oven preheated to 350 degrees, and I will show this to you exactly what it should look like before I throw it in the oven. It's been just short of 30 minutes, and our Homestyle dough has risen, and it looks great. You see how it's peeking up over the edge of the loaf pan? That lets me know that it's ready to go into the oven, and it's gonna continue to rise as it bakes. But I'm gonna go ahead and throw this in the oven. It's preheated to 350 degrees, and I'm gonna let it bake for 30 minutes. Okay, y'all, our Homestyle white bread is fresh out of the oven. It is piping hot, but it smells so good. So let's go ahead and turn it out of the cast iron loaf pan. I like getting my bread out of the loaf pan right away. Came right on out, no problem, because we oiled up our cast iron so well. So it should just slide right out like that. Look at this gorgeous little loaf of bread. Doesn't that look so pretty? Look at that. Okay, this is what I like to do. I am going to rub this all over with some melted butter. I have my little melting pot and I have some melted butter in here. And I am just gonna kind of rub this all over the top of this loaf. And I always do this because I like that buttery flavor that it gives it. It gives you a softer, nicer crust, and it gives you that pretty shine. So I just think it just gives it a nice finished look when you're done with your bread. Now you can use a cooling rack if you like. I just don't really like cooling racks because I don't like the bottom of my crust to get crunchy. So I like to cover it with a tea towel, completely cover it, and that warmth and that condensation in that towel will kind of give you a nicer, softer crust. So that's what I like. Now, I'm gonna let it cool just for a little bit. I never let my bread really cool because I always like to slice into it and eat it nice and warm. But if you let it cool, then you'll get a better texture, a better crumb to your bread. So, and it'll slice better. So that's good to know. But if you want to eat your bread that you just spent a bunch of time on, you made homemade bread, if you want to eat it warm, you eat it warm. So I'm gonna let this cool just for a little bit and then I'm gonna slice into it and we'll check it out. Look how pretty this loaf of bread is. Isn't that so nice looking? Oh, I just love it. So nice. I almost hate to cut into it because it's such a pretty loaf of bread. But it's cooled off a little bit and it is time to cut into it. Like I said, if you wait till it cools, then it'll slice easier. You'll get a better texture out of your bread. Oh, look at that. Perfection. It is nice and soft. Oh, it's just perfect home-style white bread. Look at that. This is the bread bag I'm going to store my Homestyle white bread in. This is a beeswax bread bag, and my daughters and I are actually making these together. This is our chicken coop pattern. We have lots of fun patterns, but this is one of my favorites. Beeswax is naturally antibacterial, and it helps keep your bread from molding. And this bread bag is infused with that beeswax, and it keeps it nice and fresh. So in an effort to use a little bit less plastic in the kitchen and with our foods, this is what I have started storing all of my bread in, and I am really pleased with them. Plus, just look how cute it looks on your counter. So I will leave the recipe for this Homestyle white bread down in the description. You can print out the recipe, and there'll also be a link for our beeswax bread bags. This is an 11 by 17. That's what they all are. They're nice and big. You can fit a couple loaves in there. Thank you so much for being here with me on Robyn on the Farm. I will see you next time.
Robyn's in the kitchen, dough beneath her hands, wheat from the fields and eggs from her land. Sunlight through the window, a warm golden glow. She's working hard to make that dough. With flour on her apron, loving each knead, ground wheat fresh.